Okay, remember me? I'm Greta Van Susteren, and are you ready to learn about another amendment to the U.S. Constitution? How about the Second Amendment? You've probably heard a lot about it. Probably heard mostly arguing because people sure get hot under the collar when it comes to the Second Amendment. So why all the disagreement? Besides its huge importance, because rights are important, well, people get hot under the collar about it because they don't agree what it means. In fact, there are two very different ideas of what the Second Amendment means. So let's take a look at it, and let's start with the basics. I'll help you sort it out. And there's nothing more basic to start with than the actual words. So here are the actual words to the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So now do you understand it completely? You don't? Okay, I confess I don't either. It's complicated, and there's a lot of room for interpretation of what it means. So the amendment itself may have been perfectly clear to everyone in 1791. That's when it was written, but this is 2020, and the United States has changed immensely in the 200 plus years. But one thing is certain about the Second Amendment. At its core, the Second Amendment stands for the general right of an individual to keep and bear arms. Do you have to be in a militia like it says in the amendment? That's a civilian military force. No, you don't have to be in a militia to have the right to bear arms. In fact, I think that's one of the few things that people don't disagree with about the Second Amendment. But here is the gray area, and this is where people disagree. Does it mean all arms? For instance, do I have a right to own a military tank with a big cannon on it, assuming I could find one on eBay to buy and that I could afford it? Or what about those automatic assault weapons? What about those questions? Well, the answer to those questions depends on who is explaining the Second Amendment, how that person looks at or interprets the Constitution. And in general, there are two different schools of thought. Here's what the first school thinks. The first school of thought in interpreting the Constitution says it is a living document. It was written many, many, many years ago, and as it's such, it must evolve and be interpreted as our country evolves. In other words, the Constitution lives. It evolves. And they point out that when the Second Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1791, there were no assault weapons, no automatic assault weapons. There were no big army tanks with big cannons. Instead, there were just muskets that were used to hunt and protect homes. It's a lot less firepower than we have now. The living document enthusiasts say, since the framers of the Second Amendment way back then didn't know about the weapons of today and could not predict what they would be, that the amendment must be read to evolve, to meet the change of time, and hence the reason you can have some restriction on guns. Not all guns are restricted, but there's some restriction of possession of arms. Okay, let's move to the other group. The people who do not view the Constitution as a living document that changes over time. These people are originalists. They read the Constitution strictly, meaning it says what it says. And they point out the Second Amendment says arms, right to bear arms, and no more. And they say it's wrong or unconstitutional to add meaning to the amendment beyond the plain words without going through the process of actually amending the Constitution, which of course is a very long and very difficult procedure. But originalists say simply, just read the words. And if you think the amendment should be limited to certain weapons, like no automatic assault weapons or those big tanks, then amend the Constitution and that amendment to state precisely that. Now, over time, despite the originalist views of how the Constitution should be interpreted, that you just look at the words, laws have been passed to limit the types of weapons people can own. Many lawmakers hold that the Second Amendment is not absolute and can be interpreted without violating the Constitution. The originalists cry foul when that happens, sometimes winning, sometimes not, depending pretty much on the weapon. But so far, the courts have permitted some restrictions on the right to possess arms. Is the dispute over what the Second Amendment means in 2020? Is it now settled? Not a chance. People will disagree on this one for a long time. The Second Amendment is one of the most controversial amendments to the Constitution because people look at it differently.